Well, welcome everybody to the 7th hydrogen session sponsored by the Hydrogen Energy Center, which has spent the last 25 years promoting the use of hydrogen as a key enabler in the renewable energy future. And Valerity, a consulting firm to energy companies that has been happy to put together these presentations, namely me, your host, Brad Bradshaw, today. We're going to keep to schedule today, finishing up just around 1 p.m. And we welcome questions for this presentation. So we encourage you to load any questions you might have up in the chat room as we move along through the presentation. It's kind of a speed run from beginning to end typically. So we do welcome and leave time for dialogue at the end. So I think we're ready to go. Rick, is that the case?
I think so. I've noticed that people are very adept at getting onto Zoom calls quickly. We had a very large number of people jump on to the presentation in the 45 seconds before 12 o'clock. So, and we may have a few more, but I think you're okay to start now.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk about electrolysis. And I'll provide the agenda for today's meeting. We'll give a little introduction on what we refer to as HEC, the Hydrogen Energy Center. We'll speak a teeny bit about Valerity. And then we'll talk about where this industry is going in terms of clean hydrogen production. And the use of the word clean is very specific. The Secretary of the Department of Energy this week introduced the Hydrogen Shot program to achieve $1 per kilogram hydrogen by 2032. I think the use of the 10-year time frame was used in the DOE announcement. And they specifically referred to clean hydrogen, which is challenging, of course, because we're talking about green hydrogen today, really, which is electrolytically produced hydrogen. And then there is hydrogen produced with steam methane reformation, or ATR, which then can be cleaned up from a carbon perspective using carbon separation, sequestration, and use, CCUS as it's referred to. So we'll talk about the demand for clean hydrogen and how that corresponds to the demand in the future for electrolyzers. We'll look at the economics of electrolyzers and the different types and characteristics of electrolyzers. We'll also mention some of the gigawatt announcements that have been coming out in the last 18 months, plus a sampling of the electrolyzer products that are offered by some of the major players in the industry. And I apologize if there's somebody on the call, of course, that is from a company that we don't represent in our information today. That's just a factor of trying to keep the presentation to a certain level of scale. The Hydrogen Energy Center is a nonprofit professional society that is focused on developing hydrogen as an enabling solution, as I mentioned earlier. Involves the industry in a few different ways: public forums and conducting research and implementing projects. So the three primary areas in which HEC has been involved. In fact, HEC took the lead on an innovative renewable hydrogen generation, storage, and use project 15 years ago, producing hydrogen from solar energy, storing it, and then using it for backup power. And it was an animal rehabilitation shelter. and it was a way to firm up the grid using a completely carbon-free solution 15 years ago. Saying the HEC was ahead of its time is somewhat of an understatement, as can be observed. We have a number of hydrogen sessions coming up, and then we'll probably include additional sessions, which include speakers as well. So we're going to skip next week. The following week, June 25th, we're going to talk about hydrogen production with carbon separation. Steam methane reformation plus post production carbon separation. This is meaningful because there are an awful lot of hydrogen that is produced without having the carbon addressed. And to keep those industrial processes moving, the various entities have to look at the marginal cost to address the carbon issue. We'll also talk about some innovation in that space with the production of carbon black, for example, using methane with very high temperature system. Then we'll also talk about wind to hydrogen, which is one of the emerging and fast moving solutions to addressing stranded electrons from wind turbines. The amount of curtailed power is increasing every year, and it impacts the economics of these large offshore wind projects. And consequently, there's some effort to try to monetize the electrons that might get stranded by turning them into hydrogen. Of course, the value of gas is much higher in Europe than it is here in the US. So it's easier to monetize that type of solution in Europe, and that's what we'll be speaking to. Polarity provides a range of services helping organizations understand markets and turn market opportunities into products and services. We've been doing a fair amount of work this year in the gas industry, as well as the equipment industry, helping companies develop strategies to integrate renewable natural gas, biomethane, and hydrogen into their networks to address the carbon overhang on their businesses. And we've done work for energy companies, large and small, and equipment companies around the country and the world. So I recently presented an potential forecast for hydrogen, and I now recognize, having digging into it a little bit more, that there's some folks out there that are anticipating a much larger demand for hydrogen going forward. We already have, if we monetized all the hydrogen that's being produced today, it could be something like a $120 billion business. But the demand for hydrogen going forward, according to NREL, they're forecasting a fourfold increase compared to current production of hydrogen by 2050. Bank of America had an announcement that said that that hydrogen will take 25% of all oil demand by 2050. And the EU has some very aggressive plans for electrolyzers. They have a plan for 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers being put in place by 2030. And sometimes you'll see a notation that says 2 by 40, 2x 40, because there are other countries outside but next to the EU that also have plans for an additional 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers on the continent. So very aggressive plan. Frost and Sullivan came up with a compound annual growth rate, CAGR, of 57% per year. You know, it looks like a note that might be incorrect to say 57% growth per year, but basically this is what markets are predicting and looking at in terms of the energy transition. So this is the historic hydrogen demand, and this is should be a little bit qualified because it's pure hydrogen. There's additional hydrogen that's in mixed gases that are used in various industrial processes, but this is just the pure hydrogen demand. And you can see on a global basis, it has increased substantially in the last 45 years, up to about close to 80 million tons per year globally. So let's look at the context of the historical demand to the potential future demand. We can see on this chart, the blue bars at the very bottom of the chart is global hydrogen demand that you just saw on the previous slide. And what the forecast is are the green bars to the right of the chart. So you can see fairly extraordinary. I will point out that this chart does go to 2070. That's not a common time extension, but we have this forecast in place from the International Energy Agency. And again, we can see going from 80 tons a year in 2018 to 500 million tons per year in 2070. So that's quite an extraordinary increase in pure hydrogen demand. So the real question comes to mind, how is it that we're going to produce all of this hydrogen? The amount of electricity that it will require, you can see if we just converted. Now, frankly, the amount of electrolyzers used to date to produce hydrogen is minimal. It's less than 4% of hydrogen is produced using electrolysis. Might be as low as 2%. And in the future, the forecast is for electrolysis to be used for a very significant amount of the hydrogen production, easily 80% or so, with the remainder being carbon mitigated hydrogen production. So the electricity demand just grows astronomically up to by 2070, if you run the numbers, over 25,000 gigawatt hours. That is a very large share of electricity production. And if it's all being done by wind and solar, it's an incredible uplift in terms of the amount of wind and solar we need to deploy.
I can hear you.
The electrolyzer capacity that is
No, he hasn't called me.
Again, if people could keep their microphones on mute, I think I have the capacity to do a group mute, but we'll hold off on that for now. So we can see electrolyzer capacity at 5,000 gigawatts by 2070. Just an extraordinary. We see the demand in Europe.
First to get the paperwork, doesn't it?
Okay.
Come here first.
See if we can.
Okay, you can't contact him and find out?
Well, if any participants know how I can do a group mute on the system, please let me know.
Okay.
Who's ever on the phone should mute themselves. Somebody is, we can hear you talking on your
I'll
phone,
try and call.
and it'd be appropriate if you would mute yourself.
That's for sure. Okay, I'll try and call her in the meantime. Okay, fine.
Looks like they're muted, Brad.
Yep, I just found the group mute button. I apologize for the delay in the presentation, but sometimes these small steps are required for the long journey. So the types and characteristics of electrolyzers There are three basic types of electrolyzers. I'm sure we'll see additional innovation take place here. Alkaline, PEM, and solid oxide. Now, alkaline fuel cells have been used for some time. They've generally have had the lowest cost and have been used in the larger systems that have been put in place to date. The PEM world is working very hard at improving the efficiency and reducing cost. And then the sort of the last horse to start crossing the stream, so to speak, or the solid oxide. And you may see the letters SOEC, which is how solid oxide electrolyzers are referred to. Solid oxide electrolyzer cell is the meaning of SOEC, but that's what the industry is now using. Let's point out a few things here. First is the operating temperature. You can see that the PEM has the lowest range of operating temperature. You can see solid oxide, this is in the middle of the chart, has a very high operating temperature, 650 to 1000. It requires different materials, impacts startup and shutdown. Temperature variations impact the robustness of the systems over time. So it's a more challenging technology in that respect. The other, and this is from a report that was done for the G20, published in June 2019, on the future of hydrogen. Very comprehensive report. I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to dig in. And again, a lot of this information is very fast moving as well. So you can see the CapEx line, and we have three different sublines under CapEx: 2020, 2030, and long term. And again, some industry players might come out and say their actual numbers are lower than what's presented in this information. So I think there is some conservatism here on the projections. But you can again see that solid oxide is held out as a very expensive technology. Alkaline is the lowest in the range with PEM. PEM is not in the middle. It's in the middle if you're looking at column A, B, and C, but it is much closer to the alkaline pricing than solid oxide, certainly. And I know PEM fuel cells, you know, if you're just buying the core stack without any balance of plant or dress or controls or somewhat, you know, the stacks are getting much lower price than what we're seeing here. So very competitive, very compelling. So that's very difficult for solid oxide to compete effectively with such a high price to begin with. Now, when we look at the 2030 price projections, we can see some very real movement in solid oxide. We can see some significant downward movement on PEM, and as well as alkaline. And so we're going to see innovation occur in the performance. We're going to see production economies occur, materials economies occur, and to really drive this cost down. And how does this happen? Well, the increase in the market is expected to be something on the order of 250x. In other words, the annual demand for electrolyzers today could be termed as X as the value. In 8 years, the number of electrolyzers flying off the shelf might be 250 times that. This is a really huge shift in terms of our energy economy going forward. So we will see movement on the CapEx costs. The other important factor, and I apologize for spending a long time on this, but these are the numbers which really make projects either go or no go. And it's only recently that hydrogen is at all reasonable in terms of being able to backfill you know, and displace carbon-rich fuels. It really is the economics as the drivers, and the cost of electricity on the incoming is critical. The capital cost is critical. If you're putting in an electrolyzer project today, roughly 80% assuming you're running maybe at least at a 60% capacity utilization, easily 80% of the levelized cost of hydrogen in that project is going to be the electricity. The other 20% will be the CapEx and some of the overhead. So, CapEx is really important when you start reducing the capacity utilization rate. And that's something that's important, because if electrolyzers are going to be used just to skim the top of the electricity market in terms of the electrons that are getting curtailed or have extremely low costs because it's an oversupply situation. If you have a system operating at a 40% capacity factor, that makes the economics very different from a CapEx perspective. The CapEx becomes a lot more important if you're running around 40% utilization. If you're up at 80% utilization on a system, the CapEx becomes less and less critical in terms of making the numbers work. Now, on the efficiency side, you can see, the one number that I keep talking to people about and trying to find out the validity. Haldor Topsoe recently announced a very big project for manufacturing solid oxide fuel cells. And they claim, in fact, they claim not only an efficiency of 90%, their view of long-term is 2023, I guess, because that's when they plan to have this factory up and operating. But they claim efficiency above 90% for their solid oxide fuel cells. So again, saying that the market is moving quickly and the players are moving quickly is an understatement, and that's driven by the expected demand going forward. But an efficiency of 90% within a couple of years on solid oxide, that's groundbreaking. I mean, compared to PEM, at 60%, let's say, that's a 50% improvement in the efficiency, which is just earth-shattering. That is groundbreaking, just phenomenal. This is a analysis, again, that was done by the International Energy Agency, and I basically dug into the numbers. And the yellow dots across the screen are the expected average cost to produce hydrogen on a dollars per kilogram basis. And along the bottom, we can see the different choices, as it were: grid electrolysis, renewable electrolysis, natural gas without carbon capture, and then natural gas with carbon capture use and sequestration, and then coal with carbon capture use and sequestration. Now, they're embedded in some of these numbers, not to a large effect, are some carbon burdens that then are reduced when you go to a carbon-free solution. So the variability is due to some of the policy expectations, some of the cost variability on the key inputs and feedstocks. And so we have a variability, and we also have variability because where you locate on a grid, for example. And this is particularly important in the renewable electrolysis, because what we're seeing emerging is our favorite term from the oil industry, which is geopolitics. Who would have thought that renewable energy was going to be a geopolitical element? And it's turning out to be that way because of the areas in the world where hydrogen production is beneficial, is finding deserts that are next to oceans. Last week, we had a presentation on the hydrogen hubs that are emerging around the world. And the first task in anybody trying to locate a great spot for a hydrogen hub is to find a desert next to an ocean. So you can have lots of solar energy and be able to then ship that hydrogen either in liquid form or ammonia or a LOHC, liquid organic carrier, to where you need it in the world. So we are seeing the geopolitical element emerge in the renewable hydrogen business. So we can see the range on the renewable hydrogen goes down to $2 per kilogram, fully loaded, and that's a fairly good price. We're beginning to see the markets support that this type of analysis. Again, this is fully loaded, includes operating costs, maintenance, fully loaded on the CapEx as well. The driver of renewable hydrogen being compelling really is solar. And this shows the progression of solar pricing in terms of PPAs, power purchase agreements, over time, 2006 to 2020. The circles are the size of the projects in terms of solar. And we can see we're down to, the last 3 years, basically, PPAs are around 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour here in the US. If we decide to look at these same types of prices in the global market, and again, these are the projects that are at the extreme end of the pricing realm for PPAs. We can see some projects settling in at 1 cent a kilowatt hour, which is just extraordinary. Saudi Arabia, you can see, has got great solar insolation and a lot of desert that can be put to use in terms of solar. And they, as we saw, there are 2 hydrogen hubs planned on the Arabian Peninsula. And this is the reason. The reason is that they can put in very large amounts of very low cost solar and drive very economic hydrogen. You can see that the marginal cost of hydrogen off a 1 cent power plant would be about 50 cents per kilogram. Of course, you then have to load up all the equipment costs, which are substantial. So you can see that the lead into today's presentation being the moonshot target of 1 cent per kilogram in a decade, we can see 1 cent per kilogram being reached in the desert of Saudi Arabia. You have to then, of course, get that hydrogen in a form and in a place where it's used and useful, and that certainly will add additional cost. Now, this data needs a little explanation because there's a lot of missing information in the underlying database, but I think it's important to try to capture it at any rate. This is a database of electrolyzer project announcements. A number of these have actually been put into operation. But again, we can see that the capacity announcements that are represented here reach 50 gigawatts in electrolyzers, and that's by roughly 2030. We can see the final column. This is cumulative projects that there are maybe about 25%, 30% of the projects don't have date specific, but you can see that the expectations in the industry and in the market are quite significant for electrolyzer installations. You can see in the early years of the 2020s, there's hardly any scale, but once you reach 2027 to 2030, we're talking a huge jump. And by the way, the colors correspond in this database to the type of electrolyzer, and we do have a big blue bar at the bottom, which corresponds to what's termed here unknown P2X. For those of you that aren't privy to some of the terminology, P2X just means a short form for power to gas or power to anything really, but power to gas is really what that means in this chart. Turning electricity into hydrogen. The underlying requirement, and this is similar to, you look at lithium-ion batteries, you look at Tesla. I did a prediction maybe 3-4 years ago, looking at Tesla and seeing if Tesla was going to actually satisfy their own requirements for batteries for their vehicles. And you look at the projection of their vehicle production, they would need 90 gigawatt factories for batteries. And I think they have 5 right now, and there are more that are planned. The same thing for electrolyzers, and companies have been jumping into the electrolyzer pool. These are just 4, excuse me, there's a, I'm missing the name. I put Rotterdam there, and that's incorrect, so bear with me. But Nel has put in place a factory announcement for 360 megawatts a year. And they later upgraded that to 1,000 megawatts a year production capacity. Halder Topsoe has announced a 500 megawatt a year, and understand this, they say that it's going to be able to expand to 5 gigawatts per year in productive capacity. ITM Power is putting in a gigawatt factory, 1,000 megawatts a year, and they already have fully funded a second gigawatt factory as well. And the final category, I apologize, I don't have the name of the company in front of me, but I will provide that information at a later date. I think Lindy is involved. I think it's actually, it might be a Siemens, actually. Siemens Energy, correct, has announced this 500 megawatt a year project in Spain. So that last category is Siemens Energy. So the last few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the companies in terms of what their product offerings are. And they're a little bit all over the map, but moving very, very quickly. So Nel is one of the major electrolyzer companies in the world. They're founded, as you can see, in 2927, obviously a typo, 1927. And they have deployed 3,500 electrolyzers around the world. Now, it is important to note that Nel acquired Proton Onsite, and it may be likely that the bulk of those big numbers on the number of electrolyzers installed around the world are due to all of the laboratory desktop electrolyzers that Proton Onsite has been selling for the past 15-20 years installed around the world. Now, they do have a mix of products. Their core product capability is alkaline in terms of the what we used to call the heavy iron in the business. Then we can see that they also have a series of PEM electrolyzers as well. They can do with this single A series up to 8 tons per day. Plug Power, as of maybe 6 months ago, was operating at 14 tons per day for all of their customers around the world. So 8 tons a day is very significant from a single location. That efficiency actually is quite good. It's the most efficient electrolyzer in the market as far as I've observed topically. ITM Power, they've been focused on the PEM business, and they have a number of products. You can see their biggest product is a 10 megawatt electrolyzer with 15 stacks. And then again, they really have a core system based on their number of stacks that they apply. So they've identified a core design, which they replicate modularly through their systems to provide a full range of capability. Now, Cummins is not a name that one would align with electrolyzers, but this company is moving fast and moving hard to be in this business. Very, very smart on their perspective. They acquired a company called Hydrogenics, which had a full suite of electrolyzers. And Cummins is involved in both the alkaline and PEM. And they did last year win a $2.3 million project with the Department of Energy on the solid oxide fuel cell business. They are building a 20 kW solid oxide electrolyzer system to be used over a 6-month period in a customer's site. So they're moving quickly to not only develop solid oxide capability, but to deploy at least an alpha type version of the solid oxide fuel cell. I will also note that earlier Cummins had a relationship with a company called Ceres, CERES, which is a steel plate solid oxide electrolyzer, if I recall correctly, company. They only sell stacks, and Ceres does, and so they aligned with Cummins to develop a system as well. So Cummins is involved in all three of the major types of electrolyzers, and as you can see here, their largest product, based on the information I have, goes all the way up to 25 megawatts, which is monstrous, certainly, in the industry. This is a company to watch. Another acquisition to get in the business, Man Energy Solutions acquired H-Tech. They did it in 2 tranches. They started with a sub ownership share, and then a dominant ownership share, or an acquisition of the remaining shares of H-Tech. And the H-Tech systems here, you can see they're much smaller. So it's an early entry kind of strategy. And I suspect we're going to see larger scale products emerge out of Man Energy Solutions as they work to support and integrate H-Tech technology going forward. You can see they're closer to 5 kWh per normal meter, which is a little bit different than what we saw earlier with Nell. So with that speed run, we're open to a dialogue, and I do see that we have a number of questions in the chat room. Rick, is that are we
Yeah,
taking-
it's if someone's question is not answered, we will be putting on the website sometime in the not too distant future written answers to all the questions, including questions from previous sessions from this series. The one specific question that I think may lead to some additional comments is, what does fully loaded include? And I think the thought behind the question has to do with not including things like compression, liquefaction, distribution, and so on.
Yes, so that's an excellent question, and indeed, you know, we're really drawing a fence around the electrolyzer. There's a lot of heavy lifting, as I said earlier, to get the hydrogen in a form and in a place where it's used and useful. And so this analysis is all about what the cost of the hydrogen is at the point of the at the fence that surrounds the electrolyzer system. In terms of what's in that expense, that analysis, we certainly can provide additional information, but it's really very simple. It's the operating and maintenance costs associated with operating and maintaining the electrolyzer. It's the annualized capital cost for the acquisition and installation of the electrolyzer system. And then it certainly includes the energy cost in the electricity form. And that is simplified on a cost per kWh basis in this analysis, which indeed may be the case in many circumstances, as a lot of the solar is being not connected to the grid. And so these systems are not subject to grid structures of pricing, demand charges and other fees, et cetera, in addition to the core energy charge. And again, the analysis from the IEA has some additional factors, which include carbon penalties when they apply. And I do recommend taking a look at that report, The Future of Hydrogen, published in 2019, as it were.
There's a related question, some chat going back and forth about how long the amortization is likely to be with respect to the capital costs of the electrolyzer. And one of the comments is that it has to do with the life of the electrolyzer. But of course, that leads to the obvious question is, what is the expected life of these various electrolyzer types?
Yes, and I don't have an answer for that. I'm proud to be somebody who doesn't have an answer for everything, certainly. But I'm sure I think they're definitely looking at maintenance functions, but a lot of these electrolyzers are expected to last more than 10 years, as I'm aware, but there may be major overhauls of the stack systems on a periodic basis. It's a critical number.
I think I don't know if the fuel cell equivalents are, the solid oxide fuel cells and PEM fuel cells and so on, whether those lives are any guidance, but in general, those are fairly short lives in terms of large amounts of hydrogen over a great number of years. 4,000, 5,000, even 10,000 hours for a PEM fuel cell is very, very good in current market, for the current markets, but I don't think it's a good number for these future markets. But again, I don't know if that translates to the electrolyzers. There was a question about, when you were talking about the costs in Saudi Arabia, I'm fairly sure you said a penny per kilogram of hydrogen. I'm also pretty sure you meant $1 per kilogram and a penny per kilowatt hour for the electricity. Is that correct?
Yes, and I did catch that. I said something in error. That certainly I kept moving. Just to be clear, the shorthand, as it were, is that if you have an electrolyzer that takes 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram, just using a round easy number, that basically means that if you have electricity that costs a penny, that means your price for hydrogen is 50 cents per kilogram. So it's a correlation. In other words, it's a shorthand. And so if you have 2-cent power, the marginal cost to produce a kilogram of hydrogen is $1 a kilogram. So that's the shorthand. So if we see a penny a kilowatt hour in Saudi Arabia, which there have been 2 PPAs that have hit 1 cent power, one project in India and one project in Saudi Arabia. One in India is slightly above $1, but it's very close. That basically means your marginal cost for hydrogen just using the electricity is 50 cents a kilogram. And that's an extraordinary starting point. So I hope that helps to clarify.
David Posen asks, given the lower efficiency, higher capex, and need for precious metals, what are the arguments in favor of PEM fuel cells? I mean, electrolyzers, excuse me.
Yeah, I think their capex is, because of the volume of production, is going to be on a leadership board. I mean, it's almost like Betamax. It might not be the best solution, but they'll be robust and cheap as we go forward. We'll see. Efficiency is going to play a much larger role as solid oxide begins to mature from a capex perspective.
Did Brian, did you have a specific comment on that same question? I wasn't quite sure what your note load following meant. If Brian could unmute himself and tell us.
So this is Brian. What I was saying is that what we've seen PIM electrolyzers used for is that their ramp up time versus the others is significantly better. So they do a much better job of your typical load following application or utilization versus the alkaline or the solid oxide.
That's great input. Brian, do we know what your last name is?
Williamson.
Williamson?
Oh, great. Well, thank you.
Sure. From Jericho Energy Ventures.
Robert Myers asks, are any of these organizations targeting electrolyzers mounted on OSW platforms?
Offshore wind platforms, I take it. Yes, in fact, ITM Power is putting one offshore. I think with Ørsted, if that's the name of the wind power company. The cost to move hydrogen from a windmill offshore to land is cheaper than moving electricity from the windmill to land. It really, all that really is focused on is the capital cost of the cabling and the deployment of the cabling. It's actually a lot less expensive to put in a hydrogen pipe. This is what I understand from the actual industry analyses that have taken place. I have not dug into it myself. But obviously, if you move enough electricity, that you're going to amortize the cost of the trunk line. But yes, so that is happening.
Frederick Klatt, you may want to unmute and add something to this, but as I understand it, your question is whether or not the $2.90 per kilogram number from renewables includes real estate costs and other things. Am I reading that correctly? I guess Frederick has not found the unmute button yet. We have another question asking how long electrolyzers last, and we will do the research and post the answer to that with the answers to the other questions.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question.
Next question is, what other components are included along with electrolyzers on the CapEx dollar per kilowatt slide for type of electricity?
What's the list
Not
of?
for electricity, electrolyzers. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So Anand, is the question what other
What's the BOM? Like, is it
equipment?
just the cost? Is it just the cost of electrolyzers, or is that the cost of the entire system generating the hydrogen? And what's the capex include? That's my question.
Yeah, we don't know. There is a number that includes other expenses for the project, including installation and balance of plant. What is on that list, Anand, is I'm not aware of those details, but it's really just a way to compare on a level playing field, the different choices and what the implications of those are. That's a great question.
So Brad, just to clarify for me, does that mean that the dollar figures on the slide do not include balance of plant or do include balance of plant?
They do.
They do.
Yep.
Let's see.
It does not include compression, storage, you're not generating ammonia. There's no, I mean, you're not doing liquefaction. In other words, it's not useful hydrogen at that point. Just to be absolutely clear, there's a lot of expense, as I've mentioned, to get it in a form, in a place that's used and useful, but it does try to capture, for just the core production using electrolysis, the balance of plant and installation and permitting and those costs. But again, it's a very high level analysis, I suspect.
So Lori, kind of be prepared to chime in here in a second, but as I understand it, your question is whether or not these costs include the cost of financing. I thought the cost of financing was included in the CapEx numbers, Brad.
It definitely is. The CapEx includes capitalization of the equipment and the installation and amortized.
So obviously the cost will vary depending on how many years you amortize and what the interest rate is.
Absolutely.
It says, which of these three electrolyzer technologies is able to be connected directly to wind farms and follow the variable electricity production from the wind farm?
They all claim a certain capability of load following, but we do know that in the wind and solar have spiky events, the cloud cover issue with solar, and certainly wind has a lot of dynamics going on, and the other thing, of course, is that you can do DC to DC, but the windmills are all producing AC. So I have not looked in terms of what kind of rectification or, whether you need, to change the AC back to DC on the wind turbines, and what that effect is as well. So there's a lot of issues, I'm sure, with tying the systems together. One of the things we look at is balancing capital cost. And if you have an electrolyzer with a high capital cost and you have batteries with a capital cost that might be half of what the capital cost is of the electrolyzers, what that means is you're going to want to use batteries to improve the capital utilization rates of the electrolyzers, which improves the economics of the electrolyzers. We've done modeling of what's called in the industry an 8760 model, where you model each hour of the year with multiple systems all talking to each other at every hour of the year. And that's a way to find a balance. So I would be surprised if a wind turbine system is hooked up to an electrolyzer without a set of batteries, because if there are no batteries, that means it's money that's just funding a research experiment instead of optimizing the capital allocation to the project. So it's very likely there'll be batteries that will be used to optimize the size of the electrolyzers, reduce the size of the electrolyzers, and improve the capital utilization rates of the electrolyzers in these systems. At some point, if the electrolyzers are cheaper than batteries, then I think then the batteries might be used as a buffer to mitigate difficulties on sinking the energy draws. Good question, though.
So Frederick, I see that you've found your unmute button. Do you want to return to your question about real estate costs? Oops.
Rick, as I've
Oh, I guess
mentioned,
maybe he can't unmute. Okay.
okay. Rick, as I've mentioned, we have a tight schedule. I do on this particular call, which will likely not continue in the future, but I do today. So I will need to jump off in a few minutes. So do you want to manage the process after I depart, or would you like to just identify one or two more key questions at this moment?
No, I think we've covered most of them, and anything that we've missed, as I said, I'll pick up in the written answers. I had one quick question. I know there's such a thing as a molten carbonate fuel cell, which runs at very, very high temperatures. Is there also a molten carbonate electrolyzer?
Great question, which I have absolutely no clue. I did say at the beginning, we are likely to see a lot of innovation. I've heard of other designs as well. And today's discussion was really just to cover the heavy iron that we're seeing move in the industry. So that's a great question, Rick. Well, with
All right,
that,
I think that's it, Brad.
that's excellent. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your participating today. I hope it has been informative. We are available to answer any additional questions going forward, but we are seeing a sea change taking place in the hydrogen industry and just an extraordinary upswell of demand across the entire technology value chain. So I do encourage you all also to look at the HEC site and consider becoming members. I think we charge $50 a year, and that's very helpful in terms of supporting these webinars and the infrastructure needed to get the job done. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a good session, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Rick.